Julia, standing near the door of her classroom, quietly observed Michael. The boy's gaze briefly met hers, and Julia thought she saw something there: fear. Desperation. When the man reached Michael, he grabbed the boy's arm without a word, pulling him towards the gate. Julia's heart raced. Why does he never smile when he sees his uncle? She thought the image of Michael's teary eyes from the previous week flashed in her mind. He had whispered almost inaudibly, "I don't want to go with him." That sentence had haunted Julia ever since it hadn't started all. At once, Julia couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when her unease over Michael shifted from a vague discomfort to something deeper, more sinister, but looking back, she realized it had been building for weeks, like a slow fog, creeping into her thoughts, clouding her mind with worry. Michael had always been a quiet boy. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, nor did he ever demand attention in class, yet his silence had begun to feel heavy, oppressive. Even while the other children raced around during recess, shouting and laughing, Michael would sit by himself, sometimes in a corner of the playground, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if he were trying to disappear into it. Julia first thought he might simply be shy, a little slow to warm up to new people or situations, but it wasn't just shyness. There was something more in the way he isolated himself, as though he was purposefully avoiding the joy and freedom other children seemed to take for granted. His clothes were always a little too worn, his shoes scuffed, and his shirts wrinkled, as if no one at home paid much attention to how he looked. It wasn't neglect, at least not the overt kind. It was the subtle kind, the kind that lingered in the details, in the small things no one seemed to care enough about to notice. And then there were the drawings, dark, strange drawings that filled the pages of his notebook, where other children sketched colorful scenes of parks, animals, and stick figure families. Michael's sketches were full of shadows, abstract shape, and solitary figures standing under rain-filled clouds. They weren't grotesque, but there was an unmistakable sadness in them, something that tugged at Julia's heart. She remembered the day she offered him a new sketchbook, hoping to see a spark of joy in his eyes. He had accepted it hesitantly, barely managing a whispered thank you without ever meeting her gaze. The moment stayed with her, the way his small hand had gripped the sketchbook, as if it was something foreign, a kindness he wasn't accustomed to. The thought unsettled her, a growing knot of anxiety tightening in her chest every time she looked at him afterward. That night, the memory of Michael's tear-filled eyes haunted her. As Julia sat at the kitchen table sipping her tea, her mind wandered back to the scene over and over when Jonathan walked in. She shared her concerns. "It's not just shining, John," she had insisted. "There's something wrong. He doesn't want to go home with that man." Jonathan had listened quietly, leaning back in his chair with that easy, confident posture he always had. His real estate business had taken off in the past few years, and with it his demeanor had changed too. He had become more practical, more focused on the world of business, and less on the subtle nuances of human behavior. "Julia, you're overthinking it," he said calmly. "You're his teacher, not his mother. Let the parents and guardians handle their responsibilities. Focus on your job." His word stung more than Julia cared to admit. There was a dismissiveness in his tone, as if her worries were baseless, nothing more than the concerns of an over-attentive teacher. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's silence, his tears, were more than just childhood nerves. She knew something was deeply wrong, and for the first time she began to question if she could truly count on Jonathan to support her in finding out what it was. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school courtyard, highlighting the stillness of the air. As parents picked up their children, her gaze rested on Michael, the quiet boy with downcast eyes and a timid demeanor. He was standing a little apart from the other children, clutching his backpack tightly, his body language tense and withdrawn. Something about the way he stood there, separated from the usual childhood excitement, made Julia's heart ache. Her eyes shifted to the man approaching Michael. The man moved with impatient, hurried steps, his face set in a rigid expression, eyes sharp, darting around as if he wanted to avoid being noticed. It was the same man, the same routine. Every day he arrived like this, and every day Michael hesitated before following him. Michael didn't resist, but the reluctance in his steps was palpable. As a teacher, she had learned to trust her instincts when it came to children, and this instinct, this goring sense that something wasn't right, had only grown stronger with each passing day. She knew Michael wasn't like the other children. He rarely spoke, didn't join in on games, and there was always a distant look in his eyes, as though his thoughts were somewhere far away, in a place too dark for a child his age. The next morning, Julia approached Michael during recess. He sat alone on the far edge of the playground, scribbling something in his worn-out notebook, his eyes focused on The ground. Julia crouched beside him, her voice soft, careful not to startle him. "Michael, how are you today?" she asked, hoping to start a conversation. Michael glanced up briefly, then returned to his drawing. "I'm fine," he mumbled, barely audible. Julia wasn't convinced. She pressed on, trying to sound casual. "How's everything at home? Are you happy with your uncle?" There was a pause, a long, heavy pause. Michael's pencil slowed, his hand hesitated over the page. Without looking up, he whispered, "I don't know." Those three words sent chills down Julia's spine. It was evasive, yet it spoke volumes. Michael's refusal to open up only deepened her concern. There was something he wasn't saying, and Julia could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. That evening, Julia stayed late at school, poring over student records. Michael's file wasn't thick. He had joined the school a few months ago, just after his parents had died in a tragic accident, but what caught her attention was the absence of a legal guardian. The man who came to pick him up wasn't listed anywhere in the school's documentation. No paperwork, no formal adoption, no legal responsibility, just a blank space where there should have been a name. The hairs on the back of Julia's neck stood up. She knew there was more to this than met the eye. The next day, Julia made a decision. She couldn't let this rest, not with a growing sense of dread tightening in her chest. After school, when the man came again to pick up Michael, Julia followed. She kept her distance, staying several cars behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The car wound through the city streets, away from the busy center, and into a quiet run neighborhood. She had never been to the house they stopped at. It was old, its paint peeling and windows dark. It stood at the end of a street lined with abandoned homes, a place forgotten by time. The man pulled Michael out of the car and led him inside without a word. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Something wasn't right. She sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the house. It was too quiet, too eerie, and in that silence, Julia knew this was just the beginning. Something terrible was happening behind those walls, and Michael was trapped in the middle of it. Julia had never been one to act impulsively, but this time her instincts screamed for action. The images of Michael's withdrawn, fearful face haunted her every day. She saw that hesitation in his eyes as his supposed uncle came to collect him. Julia knew something wasn't right, but every time she voiced her concerns, Jonathan was there, calm and composed, to reassure her that it wasn't time to report it yet. "Julia, you need to be careful," he would say, his voice soft but steady. "We don't have enough proof. Reporting it too soon could jeopardize everything." His words made sense on the surface. Jonathan had always been the practical one, the steady hand that balanced out Julia's more intuitive side. She'd leaned on that strength for years, trusting his judgment in situations where hers felt clouded by emotion. But this time something about his logic felt off. The more she pressed about Michael, the more Jonathan seemed determined to hold her back. One evening, after another failed attempt to engage Michael in conversation, Julia brought up the idea of going to the police again. They sat at the kitchen table, a quiet tension filling the room. The soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual, and outside the wind was picking up, rattling the windows. "I can't just stand by and do nothing, Jonathan. Something is very wrong. I've seen the way Michael acts, the way he flinches when that man touches him," Julia said, her hands clenched tightly on the table, knuckles white. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I get it, Julia, I really do, but we can't rush this. You know how delicate these situations are. One wrong move and the entire investigation falls apart. We need solid proof, more than just gut feelings." Julia's heart sank. She had hoped for his support, but instead he was offering his usual calm reasoning. "But we do have proof," she insisted, voice rising. "I've been documenting everything, his behavior, the way that man handles him, the inconsistencies in his records." Jonathan shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "Julia, what we have isn't enough. I don't want you to get in trouble or be dismissed because you acted too soon. Let's gather more. We need to be sure." His eyes met hers, and for a moment Julia wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Jonathan was right, that caution was the best course, but something in his gaze felt too rehearsed, too practiced. It was the same look he had given her every time she brought it up, a look that dismissed her instincts. She felt her resolve waver, but nodded anyway, swallowing the unease bubbling in her chest. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll wait a bit longer," but deep down the decision didn't sit right. A week later, Julia found herself sitting at her desk, flipping through the notes she had meticulously kept on Michael. She had everything to dates, times, descriptions of his behavior, photos she had secretly taken of the man who claimed to be his uncle. It was enough, she told herself, enough to Finally make a move, she called Jonathan into the room, excitement and anxiety mixing in her voice. I'm going to hand this over to police today, she said, laying the folder in front of him. Jonathan glanced at the documents, his face unreadable. You're sure you've got everything? He asked, his voice even. Yes, she said, her confidence building. I've got everything we need. Jonathan nodded slowly, then smiled, a soft supportive smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. All right, Julia, let's make sure it's all in order before you send it off later that afternoon. As Julia prepared to meet with police, she reached for the folder she had carefully put together the night before, but it wasn't on her desk. Frowning, she searched through her drawers, then moved to the shelves. Still nothing. Panic started to rise as she checked every corner of the room. Jonathan, she called, walking into the living room where he sat reading the paper. Have you seen the folder I left out? He looked up, his expression calm. No, I haven't. Are you sure you didn't misplace it? I know I left it right here, she said, her voice wavering with growing anxiety. She continued searching frantically, but the folder was gone. I'm sure it will turn up, Jonathan said with a shrug, returning to his newspaper. Maybe you just need to take a breath, Julia. You've been under a lot of stress. Her head spun as she stood there, feeling a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She wanted to believe it was just a mistake, that she had misplaced the folder in a moment of distraction, but the thought needed her. A thought she could shake. Jonathan knew. Julia looked at him sitting there so calmly, and for the first time doubt about her husband began to creep into her mind. She had trusted him for years, but now everything felt off. The tightness in her chest grew as her mind wrestled with conflicting emotions. How could someone who claimed to love and protect her be capable of erasing everything she had worked for? The atmosphere in Julia's home had shifted almost imperceptibly at first, but over the weeks, as she became more consumed with the mystery surrounding Michael and his unsettling uncle, she couldn't ignore the way Jonathan's behavior began to change. It was subtle, but to Julia it felt like every conversation was turning into an argument. Every question she posed was met with deflection. You need to stop worrying about this, Julia, Jonathan said, his voice tinged with frustration. He was sitting at the kitchen table flipping through a newspaper, but Julia could tell he wasn't reading a word of it. Julia stood by the stove, staring into the pot of soup she had been absently stirring. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. I'm not making this up. There's something wrong with Michael's situation. I can feel it. Jonathan's sigh was long and heavy, a sound she had heard too many times lately. He folded the newspaper and stood up, crossing the room to stand beside her. Julia, you're a teacher, not a detective. Let the professionals handle it when there's something concrete. Until then, you're just going to make things worse. His words felt like a slap, though his tone was calm, almost soothing, and yet Julia sensed the underlying impatience, the quiet dismissal. It wasn't the first time he had urged her to back down, to stop pushing, but what unsettled her most was the way Jonathan had started interjecting just when she was on the verge of taking real action. There had been moments, small but strange moments, where Jonathan had distracted her at critical points, when she had nearly decided to call the police after following Michael's uncle. Jonathan had talked her down, convincing her to wait until they had more proof. When she had found Michael's records incomplete and raising more questions than answers, Jonathan had suggested they let things be, that perhaps it was just a bureaucratic oversight. But what troubled Julia was the frequency of his interruptions, as though he were deliberately preventing her from getting too far ahead. It wasn't just his words. Jonathan's actions had started to raise suspicions in her mind. He would linger a little too long when she was reviewing notes, or mysteriously misplace the few things she had managed to gather about Michael's background. And then there was the night she had taken photos of the house where Michael's uncle had taken him by morning. The camera was gone, disappeared, as if it had never existed. When she asked Jonathan, he shrugged, telling her she must have misplaced it. But Julia knew better. Something was wrong, and her instinct told her it wasn't just about Michael anymore, it was about Jonathan. Too desperate for clarity, Julia reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Mike, her cousin, a seasoned detective with years of experience in cases that had crossed into unsettling territories. He didn't know who else to trust. When Mike agreed to help, he listened quietly to her suspicions, his voice calm and measured. When he finally spoke, you did the right thing calling me, Julia. I'll look into it. Just stay low and don't mention anything to Jonathan. Yet over the following weeks, Mike worked in the shadows, careful to keep Jonathan Oblivious to his investigation, he wasn't sure what he would find, but he sensed there was something more beneath the surface. It didn't take long for Mike's hunch to pay off. Jonathan, it seemed, had more than just an ordinary real estate business. As Mike dug into public records, financial statements, and property deals, he discovered inconsistencies, large sums of money moving through various accounts, properties changing hands at suspiciously low prices. Jonathan's company wasn't just flipping homes, it was laundering money, hiding illegal funds. Behind the facade of real estate, Mike sat back in his office chair, a cold wave washing over him as he stared at the data before him. This was bigger than he had expected. Jonathan wasn't just trying to cover up for Michael's uncle, he was running a much larger operation. But for all his experience, Mike knew he couldn't rush this. The connections between Jonathan's laundering and Michael's situation weren't clear yet, and without solid proof confronting Jonathan too early could endanger Julia and Michael. Still, Mike couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. If Jonathan was involved in something this serious, then Julia was in far greater danger than she realized. He needed to move carefully. Too fast, and Jonathan might slip through his fingers. Too slow, and Julia might get caught in something far darker than she imagined. Mike picked up his phone, his voice steady, as he left a message for Julia. "We need to talk. I found something, but you need to be careful. Don't let Jonathan know anything's off. I'm not done yet, but I think he's hiding more than just what's going on with Michael." Mike sat in his car, staring blankly at the documents spread across the passenger seat. His mind, normally sharp and methodical, was struggling to hold on to a single thought. The cold, hard facts he had uncovered about Jonathan should have been enough to consume him. Fraud, embezzlement, a string of shady real estate deals pointing towards something much darker. Yet every time he tried to focus, his thoughts drifted back to Michael, the boy's pale face, the haunted look in his eyes, his fragile silence. It whetted him in a way that no case file ever had. Focus, Mike muttered to himself, shaking his head as if that would help clear the fog, but it didn't. There was too much at stake now, and the stakes were rising every moment. Michael's safety came first, but Jonathan's shadow loomed large over everything. Julia had called just that morning, her voice low and tense. "We have enough now, Mike, enough to get Michael out of there." He could hear the weariness in her tone. Julia, too, was being torn apart, her growing concern for Michael mixed with the slow unraveling of her marriage. She was holding on to hope for the boy, but he could sense that her faith in Jonathan was crumbling, and today that faith would finally shatter. They met at the police station, Julia clutching a slim folder, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Mike had known her for years, but he had never seen her like this, so fragile, so utterly conflicted. "We've got the legal guardianship papers," Julia said quietly, handing them over. "He's not Michael's guardian. He's not even related to him." Mike took the folder, flipping through it. It was official. The man who had taken Michael and who was supposed to protect him had no legal claim over him at all. Worse, Julia had pulled Michael's medical records, the bruises, the undernourishment. It all pointed to abuse, a systematic neglect that had drained the life from the boy. Mike's jaw tightened as he handed the papers to his colleague, Officer Ruiz, who stood beside them. "Get this to the chief," Mike said. "We need to move now." The sense of urgency in the air was palpable as they waited for the green light to move in on Michael's so-called uncle. Mike could feel Julia shifting beside him, her hands twisting together nervously. She kept glancing at her phone, as if expecting a message from Jonathan, though he had been eerily silent lately. "I should have known sooner," Julia said, almost to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen it." Mike remained silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You did see it. You acted when others didn't. You did more than anyone else would have." Julia didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. Hours later, they watched from a distance as officers moved in, leading Michael away from the man's house. Michael looked small, so small, his eyes vacant, arms wrapped around his own body, as if he were trying to shield himself from the world. Julia's hand clenched around the edge of her seat as she watched them take him to safety. "Heck, get help now," Mike said quietly, though the reassurance seemed hollow. Michael would be safe, yes, but no amount of therapy could erase what had been done to him. There were deeper wounds that would take a lifetime to heal, but this was only the beginning. Later that evening, after Michael had been placed in a secure facility and the immediate threat was over, Mike and Julia sat across from each other in the dimly lit briefing room. Mike laid out the rest of the findings: the financial records, the connections to an international child trafficking network, and then finally the link that tied it all together. Julia's face was unreadable as She listened, her eyes locked onto the papers on the table. Each word Mike spoke seemed to tighten the invisible rope around her, constricting her breath. She didn't interrupt, she didn't ask for clarification, she simply listened, her world slowly crumbling beneath her. When Mike finally laid down the last piece of evidence, the room was so quiet he could hear the ticking of the wall clock. He studied Julia, unsure of what to say. There were no comforting words for this. Jonathan, the man she had shared her life with, was at the heart of a network that trafficked children. The magnitude of his crimes hung in the air, unbearable, undeniable. Julia leaned back, her face pale, her eyes distant. I don't know what to feel," she whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. "How do you reconcile this?" "The man I thought I knew." Mike didn't try to answer. There was no reconciling this. No words would ever make this right. He could only watch as Julia wrestled with the realization that she had been living a lie, her love twisted into a nightmare of betrayal. "I'm going to help you, Julia," Mike said firmly, leaning forward, "but you need to make a decision. Are you ready to see this through no matter where it leads?" Julia closed her eyes, her breath shaky. There was no easy choice here, no path that wouldn't break something inside her, but she nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." The house was eerily silent when Julia walked through the door. That evening, the familiar creaks of the floor beneath her feet, once a comforting sound, now felt foreign. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if it carried the weight of everything that had been unspoken between them for too long. Jonathan was sitting at the dining table, his back to her, the dim light casting shadows across his figure. He didn't look up when she entered. That in itself was unusual. He always greeted her, always had something to say, but tonight the silence between them was thick, heavy, with the knowledge that Julia now held in her heart. She stood for a moment, watching him. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, now seemed like a stranger sitting in her home. Every detail she'd uncovered, every piece of information Mike had helped her gather, had ripped away the veil of normally she once believed in. Julia took a deep breath, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." Jonathan's shoulders stiffened slightly, but he didn't turn around. About what? His voice was calm, but Julia could hear the undercurrent of tension. "About Michael, about what you've been hiding," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice unwavering. Jonathan finally stood up, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm indifference. "I don't know what you think you found, Julia, but it's not what you believe." Julia stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the man standing before her. "I know about the company, I know about the laundering, the real estate deals, and I know you're involved in something much worse than business." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear. Jonathan's face darkened. He crossed his arms over his chest, his stance hardening. "You don't understand, you're overreacting. It's just business." "Julia, business?" she repeated, incredulous. "Is that what you call trafficking children, using your company as a cover for something so?" While he didn't answer immediately, for a moment Julia saw something flicker in his eyes, fear, maybe even regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. His mask of composure slipped back into place. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "This isn't some crime movie. It's complicated, but it's not what you think." Julia's anger flared, her voice rising, despite her efforts to stay calm. "Not what I think. Michael was in danger. Jonathan, he's in danger because of you. Do you even care?" Jonathan slammed his hand on the table, his patience visibly thinning. "Of course I care. I've been trying to protect you from this mess, to keep you out of it." "Protect me?" Julia's voice trembled now with disbelief and rage. "You've been lying to me for years. All of this deception. For what? Money, power? I don't even know who you are anymore." Jonathan's face twisted, his calm facade finally crumbling. "You don't understand the world I'm in. You think it's black and white, but it's not. You think I had a choice. You always had a choice." Julia shot back, her voice thick with emotion. "And you chose this. You chose this life, and now you've dragged me into it. You've dragged in Michael into it." Jonathan stared at her, the tension between them crackling like static. For a brief moment Julia thought he might break down, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a trace of the man she once loved hidden beneath the layers of deceit. But then his jaw tightened and the coldness returned to his eyes. "Do you think your little detective friend can do anything about this? Do you think the police can help you?" he sneered. "You don't even know the half of it." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. There, it was the truth she had been dreading. Jonathan wasn't just involved, he was deep in it, deeper than she had feared. At that moment Julia heard a knock on the door, sharp and urgent. It was Mike. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been until she saw him standing there, his presence a lifeline in the chaos of her unraveling world. "We're ready," Mike said quietly, his eyes flicking to Jonathan, the tension in the room palpable. Jonathan's gaze darkened as he realized what was happening. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, but the confidence had drained from his voice. His body stiffened as Mike's team moved in behind him. Julia stepped back, her breath shallow as she watched Jonathan get handcuffed. The man who had once been her husband, the man she thought she knew, now reduced to a criminal, being led away by the authorities. The weight of it all pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She didn't cry, not yet, but as the door closed behind them, the silence that followed was overwhelming, heavy with the realization that everything she had believed in was now shattered. The rain tapped softly against the window, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet chaos in Julia's mind. It had been a week since Jonathan's arrest, and the world around her had shifted in ways she never imagined. Her home, once a place of warmth and safety, now felt like an empty shell, cold, hollow, haunted by the weight of betrayal. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty cup in her hands, its warmth long gone. The headlines had painted her as a hero. Teacher uncovers child trafficking ring, brave educator saves boy from cruel fate, but none of it felt real to Julia. The world saw her as someone who had fought for justice, but inside she was torn apart. The truth of what Jonathan had done still gripped her heart like a vice, making it hard to breathe. The thought of him, the man she had loved, trusted, being behind so much darkness, was unbearable. Every day since the truth had come out, she had found herself retracing the steps of their life together, searching for signs she might have missed. How could she not have seen it? The moments of silence between them, the vague business trips, the secretive phone calls, were they all part of his elaborate web of lies? Jonathan had been there by her side, through every struggle, every joy, and yet beneath it all he had been a stranger, a man involved in the very horrors she had spent her life protecting. Children from the irony was suffocating. Julia's fingers tightened around the cup, and she felt the sting of tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. She couldn't afford to break down, not now, not when there was still so much at stake. The knock on the door broke the silence. Julia blinked, setting the cup down with a soft clink. For a moment she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face anyone, but she knew who it was. Mike stood at the door, his coat damp from the rain, a solemn look in his eyes. He had been her steady presence throughout the past week, always there when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her. Julia opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. "How are you holding up?" Mike asked gently, his voice calm but filled with concern. Julia shrugged, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm managing." Mike gave her a nod, but the tension in the room was palpable. He knew better than anyone what she was going through. He had seen the worst of it, the arrest, the fallout, the shattered life she was now piecing back together. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Julia," he said, his gaze steady as he spoke. "It's okay to feel this too." Grief. Julia looked away, the knot in her chest tightening. "It's not just grief," she said quietly. "It's guilt. How could I have been so blind? I shared my life with him. I trusted him." "You didn't know," Mike replied firmly, taking a step closer. "You couldn't have known people like him. They hide who they are. They deceive everyone around them. It's not your fault." Julia bit her lip, her eyes finally meeting his. She wanted to believe him, to let go of the crushing guilt that had settled deep in her bones, but the truth was the wounds Jonathan had left would take much longer to heal. Mike sat down across from her, pulling out a small folder from his coat. "I'm still working on the rest of the case," he said, changing the subject slightly, giving her space. "There's more to uncover, more people involved, but we'll get them, every last one." Julia nodded, appreciating the shift in focus. The investigation wasn't over yet, and despite everything, she still had a role to play. She had helped bring down Jonathan's network, but there were others out there, others like him, and that thought gave her purpose, something she desperately needed right now. "You've been incredible through all of this," Mike added after a moment, his tone softer now. "You've done more than anyone could have asked." Julia shook her head, a bitter smile forming on her lips. "I'm not a hero, Mike. I did what I had to do." But even as she said it, Julia knew the truth was more complicated. She wasn't the person the media made her out to be, but she had fought for Michael, for the other children still trapped in the nightmare Jonathan had created, and maybe that was enough for now. Mike stood up, placing the folder on the table. "If you ever need anything, I'm just a call away." Julia watched him leave, the rain still tapping against the window. The pain of Jonathan's betrayal would never fully fade she knew that, but in the midst of it all there was a flicker of something else. A quiet resolve. The world had changed her life. Had been turned upside down, but one thing remained: the fight wasn't over. And Julia wasn't done yet. The room, where Michael now stayed, was small but filled with light, the curtains soft beige. Swayed gently by the window, catching the breeze from outside. It was quiet here, peaceful in a way that felt far removed from the darkness that had once surrounded his life. The home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, had become a safe haven for him, offering the comfort he had long been deprived of. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Michael could breathe without fear. Julia visited regularly, always careful not to overwhelm him. She had learned that trust once broken took time to rebuild, especially for someone like Michael, whose world had been shattered in so many ways. Each visit was small, deliberate, meant to nurture, not rush. She would sit by his side, sometimes speaking, sometimes just letting the silence do the work, and little by little she could see the changes. At first he barely looked at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, on his hands, anywhere but her face. There was a weight in his silence, a heaviness that pulled down even the simplest of gestures. But slowly, that began to change. His gaze would flicker toward her, not lingering but curious. His hands, once clenched into tight fists, now rested a little looser in his lap. It was the small things Julia noticed, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that spoke volumes. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the window, Julia brought him a book, an old favorite from her own childhood, a collection of simple stories. "I thought you might like this," she said softly, holding it out for him. Michael hesitated, eyes darting toward the book. For a moment Julia thought he would turn away, like he had so many times before, but instead he reached out, taking it from her hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice quiet but clear. It was the first time he had spoken to her without prompting, and Julia's heart swelled with cautious hope. The therapist had warned her that recovery would be slow, painfully, so there's no rushing this, they had said. He's been through more than any child should ever have to bear. Trust the process, and Julia did trust it, even when it felt like progress was almost non-existent. But now, sitting beside him as he carefully thumbed through the pages of the book, she could see the beginnings of something fragile and new. Michael was starting to emerge from the shell he had retreated into weeks past, and the changes, though still slow, became undeniable. Michael no longer shied away when people approached him. He spoke more, not much, but enough to show that the walls around him were beginning to crumble. The nightmares, once constant and all-consuming, had begun to fade. Julia would sometimes find him in the garden, standing quietly, eyes closed, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. It was a simple thing, but a Julia, it was everything he was learning to live again, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. As for Julia, she had thrown herself fully into helping Michael heal. Every visit, every conversation was a step toward his recovery, but it was also a balm for her own soul. She had been haunted by her role in everything that had happened, haunted by the fact that she hadn't acted sooner, that she hadn't seen the signs early enough. But now, in these moments of quiet progress, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had done something right. One afternoon, while they sat together in the quiet of his room, Michael looked up at her, his eyes steady for the first time. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with the weight of his past. Julia paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't know if things will ever be the same as they were before," she said gently, "but I think you'll find a new kind of normal, a different kind of peace, and I'll be here every step of the way to help you find it." Michael didn't respond immediately. He turned his gaze back to the book on his lap, fingers tracing the edge of the pages. "I'd like that," he said, after a while, his voice soft but sincere. Julia smiled, her heart full, but still cautious. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with challenges and uncertainties, but for now, in this moment, there was hope, a quiet, steady hope that things could get better, that Michael could heal, and that was enough for now. That was enough. The world felt quieter now, though not in a way that brought peace. Julia sat by the window, her gaze drifting over the street below, the evening light casting long, soft shadows across the road. Jonathan was gone, locked away for crimes she could hardly bear to think about. The sting of betrayal still hung in the air, an invisible presence that refused to leave. But life outside moved on as though nothing had changed. Cars passed, people laughed, the world turned, but Julia knew it would never be the same. Michael was in the next room, playing quietly, his soft footsteps occasionally echoing through the small apartment. It had been a long, painful process watching him heal. There were days when he hardly spoke, days when the darkness in his eyes seemed impenetrable, but little by little, the Boy was starting to find his way. The shadows of his past clung to him, yes, but they no longer consumed him. Julia's eyes lingered on a small drawing pinned to the fridge, a simple sketch Michael had done last week. It was nothing more than a sun rising over a hill, but it had been the first sign of hope. The first time he'd created something that wasn't wrapped in the deep somber tones of his pain. It was a small victory, but Julia held on to it like a lifeline. She stood up and walked toward the living room, where Michael sat on the floor assembling a puzzle she had bought him. He didn't notice her at first, his focus fixed on the pieces, but when he did, he glanced up with a shy smile. The fear that once dominated his features had softened, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. She couldn't afford to be there. There were too many children like Michael, children who needed someone to fight for them, to see them when no one else would. Julia had made a mistake once, turning a blind eye to the signs because she trusted the wrong person. She wouldn't let that happen again. From now on, she would be vigilant. She would protect the vulnerable, even if it cost her the last remnants of her old life, because Michael wasn't the only child who had been failed by the system, and Julia wasn't the only one who had failed to see it. In time, the next morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Michael, still sleepy-eyed, padded into the kitchen, rubbing his face as he mumbled a quiet good morning. Julia smiled, feeling the first stirrings of hope settle in her chest. Good morning, sweetheart. As they sat together eating breakfast in the quiet calm of their small home, Julia knew the road ahead would be long, fraught with challenges neither of them could foresee. But for the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel alone. Michael was healing, and so was she. Slowly, steadily, they were rebuilding their lives, one fragile step at a time. And as she looked across the table at Michael, his face brightened by the soft morning sun, Julia made another silent promise. She would never again turn her back on the signs of suffering. No matter how hard it became, she would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, because that was what mattered now. That was what gave her life meaning again. Thank you all for staying until the end of Julia and Michael's story. This is a story about hope, healing, and courage, not just Julia's, but for all of us who dare to stand up against injustice and protect the vulnerable. If there's one thing this story leaves you with, it's this message: sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from winning everything, but from standing up after every fall and never giving up on doing what's right. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring ones, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any upcoming videos. And if you have your own thoughts or stories to share, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much, and always remember, stand up for what's right, because those are the things that truly change our lives. Goodbye for now. Okay.